Hello and welcome. I'm Christine Chin, Dean of the School of International Service at American University, and I'm excited to introduce our esteemed guest and our moderators for today's discussion is our first event for the spring semester. It is my honor to introduce Her Excellency Dame Karen Pierce, the current British ambassador to the United States. Throughout her distinguished career, Ambassador Pierce has served in many capacities, including the positions of UK's permanent representative to the United Nations, the Director General for Political Affairs and Chief Operating Officer of Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London, and UK's Ambassador to Afghanistan. Ambassador Pierce, thank you so very much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. I also want to thank SIS Professors Michelle Egan and Garret Martin, co-directors of our Transatlantic Policy Center, for helping to organize this event and for serving as moderators. Professor Simon Nicholson will join them as well. Simon is the co-founder of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment and the Institute of Carbon Removal Law and Policy, two very important initiatives here at SIS. Before we begin, just a little bit of business. This discussion will last for about an hour. The moderators will draw on audience questions throughout the webinar. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function anytime at the bottom of your screen. Answers to questions will not be typed into the Q&A function, but the closed captions will include all responses. Now, to begin, Ambassador Pierce, welcome virtually to the School of International Service. Thank you. And Garret, I turn the Zoom screen over to you.
Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining in today's conversation. We're very delighted to be able to welcome Ambassador Pierce today. Particularly delighted as well on a personal note, as an alumnus of the London School of Economics. I know that Ambassador Pierce studied there as well. And also delighted because we're very thankful as well for the work of the embassy over the years through their Marshall Scholarship in encouraging the brightest and young American students to go and study to the United Kingdom. So we're particularly delighted to welcome Ambassador Pierce today. As was mentioned, we are going to try to sprinkle questions from the audience throughout. We have three major themes. I will moderate the first theme on transatlantic relations. The second section will be moderated by my colleague Simon Nicholson on climate change, and the final section will be moderated by my colleague Michelle Egan on trade. So very much looking forward to this conversation with Ambassador Pierce. Welcome. Ambassador, I'm delighted to have you in this event. Of course, it's always with a little bit of a tinge of regret that we cannot invite you on our beautiful campus, but hopefully this will be done sooner rather than later. So welcome, and we're delighted to have you with us today. My first question, I suppose, will be a very broad one. As you know, the United Kingdom left the European Union after many, many decades as being a member, and it's doing so in a brave and new and complicated world that we're facing. So my first question is really, how would you define the likely trajectory of the UK's foreign policy in the next few years? We've heard a lot of different ideas as sort of a broker for global challenges. We've heard global Britain, or focusing more on the Indo-Pacific in line with great power competition. So where do you see the trajectory of the UK in the next few years?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to American University for inviting me. I mean, I am really pleased to see how much the university has grown. When I first lived in Washington 25 years ago, we lived just around the corner. So it's very nice to see the university doing so well. So I think that's a great question. And I like to think of it in terms of starting with what Dean Aitchison said about Britain had lost an empire and not yet found a role. And I think with leaving the European Union, we can now start to define what that role is. So it is to be a global player. I stress that because at one level it sounds obvious, who wouldn't want to be a global player? But actually, in terms of American allies and partners, very few are global players. Very few have a global military reach and a diplomatic reach in the way that the UK does. So I think that aspect is very important. And we want to keep it like that. And we want to be able to put our shoulders to the wheel for all the big issues of the day. And at the moment, the Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned, is a very important area. And then we also want to be a force for good. I was very struck at the inauguration how many of President Biden's team talked about America being the leading force for good. And of course, America brings resources that we can't match, but we still think it important to be a force for good. We do that through our overseas development assistance. We do it through our contribution to NATO and global security. We do it through a more intangible but nevertheless important contribution to things like rule of law and human rights. And we're going to go on trying to expand our work in those areas. And if the Prime Minister were here, he'd say something about problem solving. He'd say what Brits are good at is problem solving. So we should make ourselves useful and put ourselves at the disposal of things like the UN to try and solve some of the world's problems, whether they're climate or their conflict. So I think those are the main areas. And then one last one that's particularly relevant, I think particularly now with COVID recovery, but it's a perennial truth. It's overwhelmingly in the world's interest that America should be present and active on the world stage. And I completely agree with President Biden on that, as does the Prime Minister. And so we see it as our job to help enable that, to burden share with America, and together to push things forward consistent with our values and interests. So I hope that goes some way to giving you an answer.
No, it does. And again, it suggests that there is a lot of work to be done for sure. And since you mentioned the Biden administration, of course, with last week's inauguration, maybe my next follow-up question will be, putting aside trade and climate change, because these issues will be explored later, and I don't want to jump on that yet, where do you see the biggest opportunities for a rejuvenation of transatlantic relations after arguably 4 difficult years? I'm asking also that question because there's no shortage of problems, so that is going to require some prioritization.
I think there are 2 immediate ones for 2021. One is COVID recovery, which brings into play things like economic resilience and supply chains. It also brings into play vaccines, particularly for the developing world, and what we want to do about health security, as well as, of course, open markets, getting economies back on track, and starting to get ourselves in a better position to tackle the big technology challenges that are coming. And then the second immediate point I'd say would be climate. Britain will host with Italy COP26 conference in Glasgow in November. So being able to make a meaningful dent in global warming is a very important ambition. And we know that the Biden administration shares that goal. So those are the 2 immediate ones. And then I think beyond that, and enduring, there's something about multilateralism making the world's big institutions like the UN, like the WHO, like the World Trade Organization, fit for purpose in the 21st century, so that they can continue to benefit millions of ordinary citizens, but that they do so in a modern way. I think that's extremely important, getting back to multilateralism, doing something about the great power competition that we see from Russia and China, who fundamentally see the world as a competition to reset the rules of international affairs. So bringing more predictability, more alliances, more cooperation to bear is an underlying theme that I think will run for several years.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned the competition of Russia and China, because that feeds nicely into my next question, which is, I know that Joe Biden has spoken of a democracy summit, and also that the UK will be hosting the G7 with the idea of expanding it and turning into the D10 with the invitation of India, South Korea, and Australia. So I would like to ask you, maybe as a first question, how do you view this agenda of rejuvenating democracies that have faced some challenges? And secondly, how do you square that with the necessity of global challenges, which might mean working with regimes that are less than savory, if I may?
I think on the first, there's something very important about bringing together democracies who are also technologically advanced countries. And that goes some way to answering your second question, which I'll come on to. It's not so much that we want to turn the G7 into the D10, so much as we want to be able to cooperate in these important areas of open markets and technology development, science, and innovation. And that's why the Prime Minister's invited those three countries. I think President Biden's idea of a summit of democracies goes a bit wider than that. And I think he certainly envisages many more people coming to it. But the whole point, as I understand it, is a reaffirmation of values, a reaffirmation of alliances and partnerships, and the fact that we're willing to work with people who want also to do things that benefit citizens rather than seek to control them. On the authoritarian states, I think you're quite right about this. One should never say never. There are certainly some areas where we would be very willing to cooperate with Russia and China. One obvious one is in the Security Council, where we, the Americans, French, Russians, and Chinese are all permanent 5 members. There's a lot more that can be done there to really make a difference in terms of managing conflict around the world. And I think our approach to China is very similar to that of the Biden administration. If you're dealing with these really big issues, global issues of health, health security, climate, then you need to work with China. We will not be able to shift the dial unless we can work with big countries like China and India as well. But India is a democracy, so it's a slightly different sort of thing. And I think we've all made it clear that we really want to cooperate with China, and we now look to China to reciprocate.
Well, I mean, this is just a beautiful passing of the baton for the next question that I'd like to ask, which is, of course, China has become such an omnipresent element in policy discussions in Washington, but also beyond. I mean, we've seen significant hardening of attitudes in Washington. I would say we've seen a certain degree of the same amongst European powers, and I would argue also for the UK to a degree. I'm thinking of the response to the protests in Hong Kong, for instance. So what do you see as a prospects for greater transatlantic convergence when it comes to the policy towards China? And where do you see the UK's role in that attempt or that approach towards greater convergence?
I think there is greater convergence. Just as it's a bipartisan issue here in the US and on the Hill, I think because of the COVID pandemic in particular, more and more countries have taken a harder look at how the Chinese run their affairs. And this is absolutely not about the Chinese people. It is about the authoritarianism and the Chinese Communist Party. Nevertheless, we do want to cooperate in multilateral institutions on climate and health, as we were just saying. And we're very happy to have a constructive, productive economic relationship. But it's got to be on the basis of a level playing field. It's got to be on the basis that WTO rules apply to China. And it's got to be on the basis, which is what you see with Huawei, that Chinese companies aren't simply a front for the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese agencies. And that's really important. And there are lots of questions around critical national infrastructure in that respect. But absent that, a proper commercial relationship with China can only be beneficial to all our citizens. And then, of course, you have human rights, which is where Hong Kong comes in and Xinjiang. And I think everybody has been very concerned by what they've seen in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And we do look to the Chinese to uphold the commitments, the international commitments they've entered into, both over the Hong Kong Treaty, but also their human rights commitment, which affect their treatment of the Uyghurs. And then lastly, the last basket, if you like, is security, South China Seas, upholding freedom of navigation, not being subject to offensive cyber attacks. You know, that's not how countries that want to cooperate should behave. And yet this is sometimes what we see from China. So I think there are lots of possibilities there for a productive relationship, but a lot of it depends on being able to have a level playing field and being able to answer these deep security questions.
Now, I wanted to pivot a little bit towards, since you did mention NATO earlier, and NATO itself, like many other institutions or group, has changed its attitude towards China, was being forced to include China in its thinking. And at the same time, we've also seen quite a significant number of challenges of internal cohesion within the alliance. I do remember French President Macron speaking of the alliance being brain dead, provocative, but it certainly spoke to, I think, some of the tension. Do you see a necessity here of really, like the Secretary General of NATO spoke of, reinforcing the political dimension of the alliance? And what is the role of the UK in doing so, if you think this is the right way to go?
I think the Secretary General's spot on. NATO primarily was always a political alliance first, which is interesting because that's not how a lot of people think of it. But of course, it comes with enormous, robust military capabilities. And I think, yes, President Macron enjoys being provocative. But I have to say, of all the organizations I've ever worked with or worked over, NATO is the one that adapts itself the best, to be absolutely honest. It is always looking for new threats and how to combat them. You're right, it's out of China, cyber, new warfare, new technology. These are all part of the things that NATO studies. And for the UK, we still hope to be leaders in NATO. We've just added an extra $21 billion to our defense budget, so that we can continue to help NATO meet the threats of cyber, of quantum, of AI, and even of space. You know, that sounds a long way away, but actually people need to begin to think about these things. And within the alliance, we have the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander position. We have a very good mission there. We contribute to the NATO Reflection Group, which was set up to give President Macron several answers to his challenge.
So I'm going to give a last question to give a signal to my colleague that we will soon shift towards more of a focus on climate change. But I wanted to end a question with a recent poll from the European Council on Foreign Relations based in London, which showed a rather alarming degree of erosion of trust in the United States amongst the publics of a lot of major European countries. Noted also that this survey was done prior to the events of January 6th as well. So to what degree do you think is that a significant problem or challenge in repairing alliances as Joe Biden spoke about trying to achieve?
I think there will be a lot of relief all over the world in many capitals. President Biden's emphasis on alliances, working with alliances on cooperation. I think that's bound to be the case. It wasn't the case, I would say, that the Trump administration did not want to work with allies, but some of the narrative made a number of countries nervous, and they were nervous, I think, that implicit and very generous American guarantee that has stood behind all our security and prosperity since 1945. This is an on the whole argument, but stood since 1945, wasn't there anymore. And this contributed to the sense of great power competition, because some of those countries would reinsure with Russia and China. Not that they like the Russian or Chinese style of authoritarian government, just that they were not sure where America stood. So I think with President Biden's election, you have a greater sense of predictability, you have a greater sense of shared endeavors, you have a greater sense of being able to sit down and work things out. And I think that's enormously reassuring. And I think that's the same in the United Kingdom as well. There's huge affection and admiration in the UK for the United States of America. And I think you'll see that coming back through and reflected in the opinion polls.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pearce. Let me now pass it over to my colleague, Simon Nicholson. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Ambassador Pearce, hi.
Hi there.
Nice to see you. I've been invited to ask a few questions about climate change. And from your remarks so far, it sounds like climate change is already top of mind. I wonder if we can start with some questions about UK's domestic approach to thinking about and acting on climate change. One thing that we know is that the UK has one of the most ambitious climate action targets and is announced to date, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. I wonder if you can tell us something about the genesis of that target, what it means, and also what the world might learn from how the UK is approaching climate action.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much. There are lots of figures, so excuse me if my eyes go to a piece of paper. We've wanted to make a real difference on climate change for very many years. So our first climate change legislation goes back to 2008, and we were the first country to legislate for zero emissions. And then since 2008, we've brought the target down. So as you say, net zero by 2050. But more importantly than that, I think, we have been able to reduce emissions by 43% on 1990 levels, which is the fastest in the G7. But critically, we have been able to grow the economy by 75%. And I think if there's one thing that we could share with people that would be a useful model, perhaps, it's that being able to grow the economy and get jobs out of tackling climate change, because you sometimes hear that it's not possible to tackle climate change and grow the economy, and we're aiming to prove that that's not the case. And I think in some ways that's the single most important signal we could send.
Do you have any thoughts about how that has happened, given that that's the goal for so many countries?
I think Brits are quite law-abiding, so if you say do this in legislation, on the whole, Brits say, oh yes, no, we must do that, and then for the avoidance of doubt, we must gold-plate it. So I think it's a little bit of national psyche there, but I think we've also had successive political leaders who have really driven this forward. And we have very good scientists and researchers who have kept the issue of climate at the forefront of people's minds. Some of your audience will know Nick Stern, who's been a great champion of tackling climate for very many years. And he went on a kind of global tour years and years ago, trying to get more interest in this. We're very close, very strong supporters of the UN, and for the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, this is a huge issue. And so we have been able to work with him as well. So that was a multiplier, if you like. And then we put our Treasury onto this issue of what it means to grow jobs and grow the economy. And I think that's really important. And we've been able to put money into incentives for cleaner buildings, which helps businesses. We've got the biggest wind farm in the world, I think, offshore wind farm. Bizarre as that might sound, but we have. And I think 5 years ago, nobody would have thought the Brits might do that. Greatly helped by developments in battery technology, obviously. But also, I think the entrepreneurship and science that does characterize Britain has really come to the fore here. So I think we've been lucky in our national characteristics, but we've also had some really far-sighted leaders and a very strong civil society. I should pay tribute to them. And people like Nick Stern, very strong, who've been able to capitalise on that and really push Parliament to pass the necessary legislation.
Fantastic, thank you. Ambassador Pierce, with the Biden administration, you clearly have newly willing partners here in the United States for climate action. You started to speak with my colleague Garret about climate change being an important piece now of the rejuvenating relationship between the UK and the US. I wonder what avenues you're seeing for real cooperation between the UK and US on climate issues.
Something very important about charting the US's nationally determined contribution. Now that the US has come back into the Paris Agreement, which in itself is a great signal of ambition and confidence, and hopefully will help raise the levels of ambition for the Glasgow conference, then we expect a very good target from the US in their NDC, which again will lead the way for other countries to follow. We are talking to the Americans about how best to get climate finance properly underway, how best to mainstream climate concerns in banking, in the way loans are done, in the way audits are done, so that when auditing and accounting happens, climate factors have to be mainstreamed. And we talk to the US a lot about the science, so carbon sequestration, what can be done in terms of biodiversity. All the main themes of COP26, I think, have a very distinct American role. But I just also, one of the things we do is talk to individual governors and city halls right the way across America. And we did that under the last administration. And I just want to pay tribute to those governors and mayors who have kept the US's climate commitments going. We have set up various things like alliances against the use of coal. We've set up various other climate groupings where there are pledges. We have a low emissions vehicle grouping where we work very closely with Los Angeles, say. So we try, as the British Embassy and the Consulates General, we try and find different sectors where individual states could find something to cooperate on, even if they couldn't do all of the things we're interested in.
So you've mentioned now COP26 a couple of times. So COP26, of course, is the next big international climate meeting to push forward the agenda of the Paris Agreement. You started to tell us something about the agenda for that meeting. There's a question here in the chat box asking you personally, will you be visiting COP26? Will you plan to attend any piece of that meeting? And what learning do you see between how Scottish and US cities in particular in this question are wrestling with climate change?
I'd absolutely love to go to the conference, but I think something like 36,000 people are descending on Glasgow, so there may not be room for one ambassador. We'll have to see. But what we do plan to do is a series of events throughout the US this year, some of them virtual. Hopefully we'll be able to do some of them in person later on in summer, celebrating and keeping people updated with what's happening on COP, and we will find a way to live stream it or tap into it somehow when it actually happens. So I think that's quite important. So what was the second part of the question?
So the second part of the question was on comparisons between US and, in this case, Scottish cities and how they're wrestling with climate change. I wonder if you can tell us something about what you see there and how we can learn from each other.
Well, the cities that have collaborated most are actually London and Los Angeles, because they have very diverse populations, are kind of multifaceted in all the things that go on there, and have a shared interest in things like low emissions vehicles. And we've done a lot of work between London and Los Angeles on that. Between the US and Scotland, I think Glasgow itself was chosen because it's a city that's made great strides in tackling energy efficiency. Again, I think the nearest parallels are probably on the West Coast. So there are many states like Michigan, like New Jersey, New York, that are making fantastic progress on targets. But in terms of more MOUs, say, between individual cities, I think that's a great idea. I think it's something we definitely ought to look at as we move up to COP26. So thank you for the suggestion.
Good. I mean, one thing that we're struck by in the United States, and I'm sure you face it in the UK as well, is just how difficult it is to get the public behind climate action. And when the public is not with you, it's very difficult to take necessary steps. And so to pick up on something you started to speak about earlier, I wonder again if there are lessons from the UK experience that we might take into the US context about how to bring the public along for important climate action.
That's a really interesting question because, of course, in the States, you have huge civil society and scientists and all these big communities who are very interested in tackling climate. I think the first thing is definitely this jobs and growth agenda. I think it's more important than we currently acknowledge, to be honest. Being able to talk through how exactly to maximize growth and jobs and share experiences, practical experiences, that really is important. And then we were lucky in the UK in that, as it happens, a lot of the places where we put the offshore wind farms were in depressed areas. So I think it's slightly different here. From what I see on the upper northeast coast, a lot of the time the wind farms are proposed for beauty spots, and therefore you have to take account of community concerns. And on the whole, we didn't have that particular problem. And there's no easy way through other than to keep talking to communities about what is possible and what mitigations might be made. But it's worth it when you do. And then I think the fact that we're simply a smaller country, to be honest, is easier to transmit the benefits across the country. And what is important, though, is to have leaders at all levels come out and really champion this. And you've got some fantastic leaders in America, in Congress, as well as in government mansions and city halls. What you perhaps have less of is big community nationwide events for obvious reasons, because it's this side of things is mainly state driven. But I think there is something about everybody coming together to see what can be done that might be important.
Thank you. So with your permission, I'll ask one more climate question and then draw a question from the chat. The final climate question, we've heard about China and India and other countries in your remarks to date. I wonder what cooperation with China and India in your mind around climate change looks like.
I think it really is possible to cooperate with India and China on most of the themes for Glasgow. So we've got 5 themes for Glasgow. One is around biodiversity and protecting nature and using nature. I think I'm right in saying that either 80 or 90% of all the plastics pollution in the world's oceans comes from just 3 rivers in India and China. So there's an obvious thing we can be doing there, and around protecting the marine environment. Another theme of Glasgow is adaptation and resilience. And this is about primarily helping developing countries have the systems and infrastructure and practices around sustainable farming, around natural disaster prevention. And obviously India sees a lot of that and has lots of experience to share. And both India and China have been very successful themselves in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I think there's a very important best practice dialogue to be had there about how you do that in a sustainable way. And then a lot around low emissions and science and what can be done to develop new ways of driving cars. For example, both countries are very good at science. Both countries have a lot to contribute. And if they had ambitious, nationally determined contributions, then that itself would make a significant dent in global warming. So I'd highlight those areas in particular.
Immensely helpful, thank you. So the final question, and then I'll pass to my colleague, Michelle Egan. I'm just drawing from the question and answer chat here. It's clear we have some students in the chat and they're interested in your career. And in particular, do you have thoughts on a feminist approach to international relations as the way that this question is framed? Is that something that is present in your mind? Has that informed your practice in international politics?
I have to confess it has not. I know Margaret Wallström when she was Swedish foreign minister, and she said, I want a feminist foreign policy. And Sweden, we're a very good partner on the Security Council. Whether it was significantly different through being a feminist foreign policy, I don't know. I think there's always a very strong human rights element, both our and Sweden's foreign policy. I think for my generation, it was unusual when I was coming through as a junior diplomat. There were many women diplomats, but it was unusual to have very many senior people. So to a certain extent, you go about things in a different way because you have to find a way through. And that, personally, that didn't really bother me too much. It's different now. Thankfully, huge strides have been made. I think it's not so much for me as a feminist foreign policy, so much as we have perhaps come to understand how different aspects of political, economic, and social all contribute to the whole. And how, if you're trying to tackle a conflict, you need to pay attention to all those elements. You can't just concentrate on the military, say. And I saw that particularly when I was in Afghanistan. A lot of the things we spent our time doing fundamentally at heart were really economic development, because that was the key to setting Afghanistan on an upwards trajectory.
Thank you. I've really appreciated the conversation. I'll pass to my colleague, Michelle.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I'm shifting the attention because there's been a few questions in the chat box as well about trade and obviously Brexit. And I wanted to start off with, the UK-US trade negotiations were started under the last administration. So I was going to ask you about the current status of the UK-US trade negotiations. And I think a better worded question from one of the chat boxes, what are the challenges do you perceive in this UK-US trade deal negotiation?
I think the first challenge is that the Americans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are very good trade negotiators, really tough. And it's always difficult to out-negotiate USTR. So that's challenge number one. To take a step back, where we are at the moment is that we have had successive rounds of formal talks with the Americans for the trade deal. And then in between, you have these working groups, which are informal, and then try and advance things by floating ideas and proposals or putting down actual text. When Catherine Tai, the new USTR, is confirmed, we will need to talk to her about getting back to the formal stage. We would like to do that. We think in terms of COVID recovery, very good to have a UK-US free trade deal. We are some of each other's biggest trading and investment partners, and good to cement that and enhance it in a deal. But we need to see what the Biden administration say. They have a very heavy legislative agenda, as I think we all know. They don't want to enter in any new trade deals, which they've said, but there is a question about what happens to the trade deals already in the making, like the UK one. Yeah. Assuming we continue to press ahead as we would like, I think there will be a big challenge around agriculture. There's always a big challenge around agriculture, to be absolutely honest, and possibly a challenge around Buy American. Now, Buy American is not strictly part of a free trade deal because it typically manifests itself on the defense side, not only, but typically. However, it's obviously of great concern to America's trading friends and partners if there's a very strong push on Buy American. So we'll need to talk about that. We've got some very good things in the trade deal. We've got some good things around encouragement and help for small and medium-sized enterprises. And both our economies rely very much on this category, this sector. But I think also in the COVID recovery context, what's really going to get the economies going again are the SMEs. So we think that's a plus for the agreement. And then it would be the first free trade agreement to look at digital commerce and e-commerce. And we think in that respect, it might even form a template or a standard for future trade agreements. So we'd see some good reasons to proceed, but we need to talk to the new USTR.
That's a great comprehensive answer. You mentioned earlier when Garret was talking about fitting rules to the 21st century. And given the fact that, you know, out of the EU now, the UK has its own independent trade policy. So what are the UK's key trade and investment priorities at the multilateral level? You've got concerns about different digital tax. You've got WTO reform. And then, of course, you're starting to see a lot more scrutiny of Chinese foreign direct investment. And one of the chat box said predatory Chinese behavior. So I wonder, what is sort of the UK's trade and investment priorities at the multilateral level?
Well, I used to be the ambassador to the World Trade Organization when I was in Geneva. And in that capacity, I went to Bali for the first truly multilateral trade deal in 20 years, as it was then in 2014. So there are always difficulties and challenges with getting multilateral trade deals. And we concentrated in 2013, 14, can't remember which, on trade facilitation, on removing customs barriers. But you also have what are called plurilateral trade agreements, which are kind of like coalition agreements. They might be open in theory to all countries, but they tend to be negotiated among a smaller group who have particular things in common or who want particular things like on intellectual property. And then, as you said, you have WTO reform. And we really do need to put a lot of work into that. We need to get a new Director General. We need to get the appellate body up and running. So all of that's very important. And on digital sales tax, I think you heard Secretary Yellen say yesterday that she favoured getting things moving in the OECD, which is exactly what we favour. And for that reason, although we had introduced a digital service tax, which caught some American firms, we had not actually collected the money because we wanted it to be an incentive to come back into the OECD and negotiate there. So hopefully that will that will move forward. But in terms of China, this is really interesting. I think we do need to enforce the WTO rules about level playing fields. There is, for me, an existentialist question about China's position within the WTO. She calls herself a developing country, and there are clearly lots of people in China who live in poverty. But when you look at what the Chinese economy represents as a whole, it's a little bit counterintuitive to think that China should have all the help and support and assistances of a developing country. So I think that's one important element. The level playing field also applies to intellectual property. I think we're going to have to look at this vis-a-vis China much more carefully. There is simply too much IP theft at the moment. So we need those WTO rules to be enforced. And then, as we were saying earlier, there's an important area around national security, critical national infrastructure that we need to look at.
Absolutely. And given the fact that, you are sort of independent now, straddling between a European market and a US market as your major markets, are you concerned about being pulled in different directions because of the different regulatory approaches? I mean, two of the most contentious issues might be, for example, food standards or data privacy. Are you worried about how are you going to navigate the needle, so to speak, between the two different perspectives?
No, but you're right. It's not straightforward. But at the moment, of course, we start with regulatory alignment with the EU because we've only just come out of the EU and the single market, and then I suspect it will diverge over time. But the key is that there can be agreement to manage and accept each other's standards. There will be in the EU-UK trade agreement, there are provisions for arbitration, independent arbitration if neither side is pleased with what the other is doing. There's also provision for fair competition. So I think those are the most important parts. We also have a commitment in the agreement to maintain high environment and labour standards. And I think that will also be of interest to the incoming Biden administration.
It sounds like your level playing field in the TCA, the UK-EU agreement, is a good model for what you're trying to promote for others as well.
I hope so. I think the good thing is the fact that there is this independent arbitration. Yeah. That's a reassurance for both sides, if you like.
Absolutely. And well, you're getting a lot of questions, obviously, on Brexit. We're only post 26 days out here. And a lot of the questions sort of stem around the issue of, the fact that there has been some public opinion shifts in Scotland and Northern Ireland, the economic implications that we're seeing in the news in terms of Scottish fisheries or Northern Ireland supermarkets. Do you have any perspective in terms of, it's a loaded question to ask about referendums on the future of Scotland and Ireland, given the provisions in the Good Friday Agreement. But I wonder if you would speak to something to do with the concerns people have in Washington about, the nationalist pressures, if you like, maybe emanating from Northern Ireland and Scotland. It's a very difficult issue.
I think they're also, although one can use a label like nationalist, I think they're actually very different in each of those places. So let me start by saying categorically, there is no threat to the Good Friday Agreement. There's no threat to the border or the lack of a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. There's still free movement of people. There's no new border checks or infrastructure on the border. So that is absolutely standing up the Good Friday Agreement. So no one should be worried about that. But the corollary, if you like, is that trade between what we call East-West, between the island of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, becomes a bit more complicated because two things are true at once. You have to have a foot in each camp. And there are checks held at a particular port, but not affecting the border. So that's very important, because fundamentally what we need to do is reassure both communities in Northern Ireland that everybody wants the Good Friday Agreement to succeed, and everyone wants the UK and Ireland, the country, to prosper and to continue to be good trading partners and good neighbours. Within Scotland, you will be aware politically that there's been increased interest from the Scottish Nationalist Party about holding a second referendum. That cannot happen without the agreement of the UK Parliament, and the British government has made it clear they will not ask the Parliament. But it is a very acute political question, and I think it will be one of the issues that is much talked about this year.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question from the audience, then I'm going to turn it back because there's been 20, 30 questions in the chat box, and I'm sure Garret will pick one or two that are really students are burning to ask. But one of your former interns at the embassy asked a question, which I think is a very good one. How is the UK adapting its public diplomacy post-Brexit?
We always had quite a strong public diplomacy campaign. We've never seen our overall identity in the US as affected by the EU. It's longer, stronger than that, and the same applies to the United Nations. So while my colleagues in Europe are doing different things, on the whole, our public diplomacy is all around why the UK is ally number one, why the UK is a good partner for the US, why we're interested in America and want Americans to be interested in us. You can always do more. We want to particularly focus on new areas of cooperation with the United States, particularly around new technology, which I think has the power to be really transformative, possibly akin to what nuclear was in the 1950s, with all the attendant philosophy and frameworks and mechanisms and thinking that came with that. We also want to put new generations of young Brits and Americans more in touch with each other. I think when I was here 25 years ago, it's probably fair to say that more people in America had a connection with Europe or with the UK, and that's less true now. So we want to find new ways of bringing people together. We've got a lot of shared experiences. The issue of racial equality, which the Biden administration attaches a lot of importance to, rightly, that's an issue for us as well. So, as I say, there's lots of areas where we can tackle some of these challenges together, either at a government level or also at the person-to-person level.
That's a wonderful answer. I'm going to pass back for the final sort of question that Garret has picked from all of these wonderful questions. Garret, can you ask the final question from the audience?
Absolutely. I was not expecting to be back, but there you go sometimes. Anyway, yes, thank you very much to the audience for a lot of wonderful questions. I'm going to pick two and offer you a choice, Ambassador.
Oh, okay.
You can feel free to answer both. But the first one has to do with Iran, which is also a big ticket item. And there's been clear differences between the United States' position towards Iran under Trump and the way the EU, the E3, the UK, France, and Germany have tried to uphold the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal. Where do you see the prospects of upholding the JCPOA, and how difficult will it be for the Biden administration to be able to re-enter and convince Iran to play ball. And the other question is more again about Brexit, I apologize, but it's about maybe the financial sector in particular that was not included in the EU-UK deal. Do you see that as a potential risk of a significant financial flight, and what might that mean for the UK economy?
Well, I'll try and do both of them really quickly, if that's all right. The Biden administration has said it will come back into the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, if Iran comes back into compliance. And, you know, the Iranians now have to think about what they want to do. They have elections later in the year. I think that's very much on their minds, and I think they are unsure of how much support in Congress there might be if they did come back into the nuclear deal. In other words, would the American administration be able to cement and codify that deal? And so both sides are looking at this. We hope once Secretary Blinken's confirmed and once staff members are in place, we hope that the E3, France, Germany, UK, will be able to come over here and have a detailed conversation about Iran's strategy. But the basic position is that the American government would like to come back into the JCPOA, but Iran has to demonstrate compliance. And we need to find a way to tackle issues like ballistic missiles and regional instability that Iran has a hand in. And those two things are important. On financial services, you're correct. There's very minimal reference in the EU-UK deal. It is expected that we will try and negotiate a separate subsidiary deal on financial services. It's not straightforward. I don't think Paris and Frankfurt make any secret of the fact that they'd like to take over from the City of London, but I'm equally certain that they will not be able to. I think, you know, if you think of the way the financial markets go, fundamentally you've got New York, and then when New York wakes up, London is closing down, and vice versa, and then you've got the Far East. And I think that will always be the pattern. And between those three centres, you can keep a lot of the world's financial business going. So I think the City of London will remain preeminent.
Well, Ambassador, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm astounded by the amount of material that we covered. I suppose a real tribute and many challenges ahead. If I may, I would deeply encourage our viewers to look at the video made by the ambassador scolding an American family about the proper way to make a cup of tea.
Oh, yes.
Entertaining. Otherwise, our center will have more events. 24th of February, we will be hosting the Austrian ambassador, and our colleague Simon has plenty of events as well on climate change and on COP. Ambassador, on behalf of SIS and American University, thank you so much for coming. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks very much for having me. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.